Mr. Engel.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I ask unanimous consent to enter into the record two documents. The first is a report prepared by Amnesty International detailing their research and documentation of this crisis. The second is a bipartisan letter on the U.S. response to this crisis sent on September 28th to Secretary Tillerson and USAID Administrator Green from Senators McCain, Cardin, and 20 of our colleagues in the Senate. So I ask unanimous consent to have those two.
Without objection.
Thank you. Mr. Murphy, let me start with you. There's ample evidence from satellite imagery and eyewitness accounts that Burmese military and security forces have been carrying out an intentional, systematic policy to drive Rohingya from their homes in Burma and to burn their villages to the ground. Medical professionals working in Bangladesh report hundreds of men, women, and children being treated for gunshot wounds because the Burmese military and security forces have opened fire on them as they flee. Senior United Nations officials have called this a textbook case of ethnic cleansing. The commander-in-chief of the Burmese military, Min Aung Hlaing, said there is no oppression or intimidation against the Muslim minority, and everything, he says, is within the framework of the law. He also said the Bengali problem was a long-standing one, which has become an unfinished job. So let me ask you, are the Burmese military and security forces responsible for violence and intimidation of the Rohingya in Burma, and do these actions constitute ethnic cleansing, in your opinion?
Thank you very much, Ranking Member Engel. The horrific actions that have taken place in northern Rakhine State are beyond troubling. This is a tragedy of epic proportions, and the security forces there in northern Rakhine State bear considerable responsibility for what we have called a disproportionate response. I think it's important to note that there are other contributors to violence in this area. There are the militant attacks that took place on the August 25th by individuals who claim responsibility for attacks that took place the year prior. There's also local vigilante action on the part of citizens and others. And these militants, according to very credible reports, are exacting violence on some of their own population. This is a cauldron of complexities. What has taken place is absolutely horrific. My Secretary of State said that it's been characterized by many as ethnic cleansing. Ambassador Haley in New York said what has taken place appears to be a sustained campaign to cleanse the country of an ethnic minority. There are unknowns. There are populations that obviously have moved in great numbers. There are other populations that haven't moved. That's why we are asking for full access of media, humanitarian organizations, all steps to stop the violence. Let me also point out to Mr. Engel to another action. The United States earlier this year helped form a UN fact-finding mission. We are asking authorities in Burma to support and cooperate with that mission so that there can be full disclosure of what's transpired, not just in Rakhine State, but I hasten to point out there's conflict elsewhere in Burma, long-standing conflict, currently ongoing in the northeast in Shan and Kachin states. But Burma is a country that's been at war with itself since the 1940s, since independence. And the current government is struggling with these sorts of conflicts and refugees and displaced persons. We've talked about the displacement inside Rakhine State, potentially hundreds of thousands. There are hundreds of thousands of displaced individuals elsewhere in the country as well. You mentioned Min Aung Hlaing. Yes. As commander of the armed forces, he has enormous responsibility to stop the violence, to act in a proper manner with the security threats they believe they face. He's not the only stakeholder. We need actions from the government, from local Rakhine officials, and Burmese citizens as well.
So you would agree with me then that this is ethnic cleansing?
Mr. Engel, I'm pointing to our members of cabinet who have pointed to voices and evidence that would suggest that there may be ethnic cleansing. I would say what's more germane, what's more important is the actual humanitarian crisis, displaced persons, violence that hasn't stopped. That's our most pressing focus. There are mechanisms, there are bodies who are looking at what best to call this, but it is, at the end of the day, a human tragedy, and we want to do everything to stop it.
So will the gentleman yield?
Certainly.
Just for the record, myself and Mr. Engel, this committee, we identify this as full-fledged ethnic cleansing.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. What are we doing right now to hold the military accountable? Do you think that reimposition of targeted sanctions against senior military leadership or businesses that generate funds for the military is appropriate? And let me say, as a first step, I would encourage the administration to immediately stop issuing JADE Act waivers, which allow members of the Burmese military and their families to come to the United States, at least until such time as violence stops and humanitarian access is restored.
Congressman, thank you. We are exploring all options available to us to effect change inside this country with a focus on the armed forces. I think it's important to point out that we have in place already a substantial range of restrictions on the military. Our engagement is virtually non-existent. There is no training. Assistance is prohibited. That reflects the fact that the transition to democracy is not complete. Democracy has not been fully consolidated. We've talked about the expansive authorities that the security forces have over their own armed forces, 3 key ministries, one of the vice presidencies in the country. They are outside civilian control, particularly in this part of the country. We want to bring about accountability. There are ample evidence and reports of abuses and allegations. We will explore further tools. The JADE Act, which Congress put into place in 2008, remains very active. There are visa restrictions on all senior military leaders and their family members. The waivers that you refer to, Mr. Engel, are very sparingly and very rarely applied, only in the cases where it's in the U.S. interests. We are examining that very closely, not considering any expansion. For the time being, the JADE Act holds, and those restrictions remain in place.
I think that one of the issues is going to be, can we get the United Nations back more engaged again in Burma, and can the UN then be the conduit to get the Red Cross and to get NGO groups back into Rakhine State? What's the prospect at the United Nations that our ambassador could work with the Security Council to lay the foundation for a more robust presence? The very criteria that I just laid out that Kofi Annan helped develop in consultation while in Burma, he had been invited in and had worked with the counselor on Aung San Suu Kyi on this issue. So there is this possibility of the UN being the mediator or helping even in this role of setting up the dialogues between different ethnic groups up in Rakhine State, if the international body can come in. Would that give us considerable leverage to get to some of these objectives?
Mr. Chairman, you rightly point out the critical important role of the United Nations, and that is important in a variety of avenues of effort. The humanitarian assistance that you refer to, also the actions that potentially the Security Council could take, and let me point out the UN bodies that deal with human rights, like the Human Rights Council. I also want to offer that our ambassador in Burma, Ambassador Scott Marciel and his team, have been relentless on this and many lines of effort to address this crisis. They are working with the government to encourage an increased role for the United Nations. In fact, there is currently a UN presence in Burma on the ground. In Rakhine State itself, they are poised to activate their humanitarian operations. We've encouraged the government to invite senior UN figures to visit Burma, engage, discuss possible ways forward. And as the chairman pointed out, in New York, our ambassador and team are quite engaged at the Security Council in forging a way forward for the UN. I just want to emphasize there are many lines of action for the UN: humanitarian, accountability, human rights, and our press is on all of those fronts and encouraging cooperation inside Burma with these entities.
Does anybody else want to comment on that?